211 is like a 911 for Health and Human Services, and above and beyond, more than half of our calls are housing related right now. And so it's when we take a housing call, the conversation is around, if you're in this critical place with your housing needs, there are other things that are going wrong as well. So it's not just what can we do as it relates to housing, but are you food insecure? What's happening with utilities? There's a lot of families that are really on the edge with making their rent payments who maybe then aren't paying heat because you can save some costs there. And so we're really trying to holistically approach what all those needs are a family could have.
I want to give a special thank you to our Season 2 sponsors, MHEB Incorporated, Amish Gazebos, Espenshade Farms, and Espenshade Mills. To learn more about our sponsors, visit wsm.org/podcast. Hello and welcome to the Restorers Podcast. I'm Jack Crowley, the president of Water Street, and today we're going to be talking about the affordable housing crisis in Lancaster County. And I'm really excited to have our special guest today, Kate Zimmerman, who is the president and CEO of United Way. Also worked with Leadership Lancaster and with Coalition for Sustainable Housing. So thanks for joining us, Kate.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Could you tell us a little bit about kind of your journey? I know there's some other things in your history that tie you to this issue, but working with Leadership Lancaster, C4SH.
Sure. My first job in the nonprofit world actually was Lancaster Area Habitat for Humanity at the time. So I really learned quite a bit about housing and the need for housing in this community while I was at Habitat. And it propelled me into the Coalition for Sustainable Housing. So that's been around for quite a while now, actually. It came out of a 2013 housing study that LHOP, Lancaster Housing Opportunity Partnership at the time, now folded into Tenfold, created to look at the housing situation across the spectrum in this community.
Right.
And as a representative from Habitat, I was involved with that. I then went on to Leadership Lancaster and now at United Way. But through that time, I've been involved with the coalition, and now I'm the co-chair with Shelby Nauman, who was with LHOP and now is the CEO of Tenfold.
Yeah. And I'm guessing each of those roles with Habitat, what a great organization, all of them, great organizations, probably gives you a different angle and a different perspective on the housing issues in our community. I want to take a step back. As we're talking about affordable housing, can you help us with a definition? People hear that phrase all the time, and there can be very specific interpretations of what we mean when we say affordable housing. Could you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely.
What do we mean?
The true definition of affordable housing is that a family should not pay more than 30% of their income to housing. But I think across the board, there's other ways we can look at affordable housing. One of the things I think of is the metrics for affordable housing. If you were just coming off the streets, for instance, and you were unhoused and moving into your first place, you probably wouldn't meet the threshold with 30% for an entry-level apartment anywhere in this nation. But all the way up to folks who are moving into their first home maybe, or our workforce. So we think about nurses and teachers and policemen and firefighters, what we need to have in housing stock so folks at that income level can afford to live in the communities they serve. And for the most part, those are out of reach in Lancaster County and really across the nation at this point as well.
Yeah, especially when you think of the concept of market rate housing, which market rate really means what will the market bear? What can I get for this, or what's a reasonable to expect for this apartment that I'm renting out or I'm trying to rent? I remember some of my history, I worked for a few years with both HDC, an affordable housing developer, and PHFA, the housing finance agency for Pennsylvania. And I remember when I worked there, this was 30 years ago, maybe it was just me, but there was this assumption that market rate housing should be affordable for your typical, not working class, but typical, like, modestly employed. You've got a decent job. You didn't have to make a ton of money to afford market rate housing. It was just kind of expected. If you've got a good job, you can afford market rate. And then there was this category of affordable housing, which was often subsidized through different mechanisms, either tax credits that helped the developers build it, or other ways of subsidizing directly those units. That was affordable housing. But we're seeing market rate housing it no longer feels affordable.
Yeah, absolutely. Market rate housing is out of reach for, I think, a lot of the folks in our community who we would assume had easily accessible housing. And I think there's a couple factors going into that, but really we're basically, we have a no room at the inn sign out right now in Lancaster County. We're at about a 3% vacancy rate, which means if you want to move, there's not much to move into.
Yeah.
And so that means the folks maybe having their first kid who want to add a bedroom, but it also means someone who wants to retire, who lives in one of those neighborhoods that's graying and starting to change over.
Right.
They don't have any place to downsize to. And so with that standstill, everyone's kind of staying in place and more folks can't enter the market.
And that vacancy rate, that's across all housing levels, correct?
Yes.
So we're seeing that.
Rental, home ownership, you name it.
Yeah. And that puts incredible pressure on the lower end.
Right.
An interesting statistic that we came across related to affordability and especially for low-income families. An extremely low-income family is defined by $27,000 a year approximately. So which is about $15 an hour is going to put you in that category. So there's a lot of jobs out there, starting level jobs that you're there. That's an extremely low income family. For every 100 extremely low income family, there are only 23 housing units that are affordable for that level in our county. What are those other 77 families doing?
Yeah, and those other 77 families, I think it's really important to point out, once again, the jobs that are being filled by these folks. And, we have a workforce development problem in this community, and we talk about our daycares, for instance. I had 2 kids in daycare, and if I would have known that, someone's sick and daycare closes, those are your daycare workers. And having your daycare workers have to commute in to your community because there's not affordable housing here.
Right.
Having your teachers, those are the folks who are the foundation of so much of our economy and so much that happens here. And that means not that they don't exist in our community. It means they're doubled up. It means they are cost burdened. Yep. It means if the car has a repair, that's probably not going to happen. And it really can be a spiral for a family.
Those are the families that are coming to our outreach ministries for food distribution.
Right.
Because they're paying 45, 50, 55% of their income for rent, let alone buying their kids clothes for school and all those other expenses that we all deal with. So they're coming to food banks here, the Lancaster Food Hub, other organizations to get supplemental food. Probably half of their grocery bill is taking care of this, which is wonderful. We love being able to support and provide. But for them to have to be in that position because of the lack of affordable housing is just a sad situation for us.
Well, and we don't pull, we talk about housing numbers, and that really is just what your rent is. It's 30% is what your rent is. Yeah. It doesn't include, hey, I live 30 minutes away from my job, so I either have to put gas in my car or the kids are in daycare longer. And there's so many other costs associated with being cost burdened in housing that don't even factor into any of this and are impacting families so critically.
Right. And I'm sure you see that at the United Way.
We see that,
a lot.
yes.
I mean, 2-on-1, but all the services that you guys are connected with and supporting, lots of them are connected to those other aspects of families that are stressed because of the housing crisis.
Yeah, and so 2-on-1 is like a 911 for Health and Human Services, and above and beyond, more than half of our calls are housing related right now. And so it's when we take a housing call, the conversation is around, if you're in this critical place with your housing needs, there are other things that are going wrong as well. So it's not just what can we do as it relates to housing, but are you food insecure? What's happening with utilities? There's a lot of families that are really on the edge with making their rent payments who maybe then aren't paying heat because you can save some costs there. And so we're really trying to holistically approach what all those needs are a family could have. You're not getting your medicine if you're barely able to afford your rent.
Can't even tell you how many times I would visit kids. When I started at Water Street, my first several years, 7 years running the youth center and then working with youth even beyond that, visiting families and going into homes that, were heating their homes with 2 plug in kerosene heaters or plug in electric heaters because they couldn't afford the gas bill. They couldn't afford to fill their oil tank. And so they were like moving it from room to room. Okay, during the day, we're heating the kitchen and the living room, and then we're going to take them to one bedroom and keep the door open and try to get enough heat to the 2 bedrooms. And it was such an eye opener for me in those days when I didn't know a whole lot about what our families were dealing with. The other thing that happens when you're overly cost burdened on your housing is there's the risk of eviction. And it's amazing to me. So we have about 62,000 renter households in our county, 62,000 households that are renting rather than owning. From July of 22 to June of 23, so one fiscal year, one 12-month period, we had over 4,700 evictions in Lancaster County. That's 7.5% of our renters dealt with eviction in a 1-year period. To me, that's just, it's almost unfathomable to think that there are that many families experiencing eviction and all that can do to you as an individual. And I'm sure that's where a lot of those 2-on-1 calls
we are seeing a lot
from.
of those calls. And, I'm a political scientist. That's my degree, not math. But all right, so 7% of our families are being evicted. We have a 3% vacancy rate. Our numbers aren't working on that. And we know that, kids who have consistent education, you stay in the same school district for at least one school year.
Yeah.
And we're not hitting those numbers even in a lot of our school districts at this point.
Yeah.
Health of a family, your ability to go to work, so much is impacted just by knowing you have a safe, decent, affordable place to live. And we can't offer that. Yeah. And I know for the 211 navigators, the folks on the phone, one of the things that's really been eye-opening to me is the trauma the folks answering the phone are starting to have because there is so little availability. So much of what we're telling folks is, and the calls keep coming and coming, but we don't have a solution for you yet, or there's not a bed available, or you have to actually be homeless for one night before we can do this intake for you. It's, you can't plan, I'm going to be evicted in a week.
Right.
I want to get some things set up. And so I have folks working for me now who are this is, their hearts break for families over and over again.
They're experiencing secondary trauma. And that's the other thing. Water Street, we deal with that all the time. And it's such an important part of our leadership here is to focus on how do we care for our staff who are trying to care for our neighbors who are experiencing this vulnerability and these tragedies, because it creates a cycle and a spiral that can really drag people down. And one of the things that we're grateful for is organizations like United Way, 2-on-1 system that is helping make connections, Water Street being available to, in the most extreme cases, when eviction leads to a spiral of vulnerability in housing and ultimately to homelessness, that there are organizations like Water Street, there are organizations like Lancaster Food Hub and the Coalition on Homelessness who are working to address the issue and provide help along the way. But we also need to address, the
system.
It's that picture. It was actually at 2-on-1 day. I was reminded of that picture of addressing the issues upstream. Yeah. Right.
I always picture that river.
You can pull people out of the river, and at some point you say, how are all these people getting in the river?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a both and, right? Like some of it is zoning regulation, I think, is one of those things we can point to. If you're required to have an acre of land to build, you have to overturn then some zoning regulations to figure that out. I also still think that there is a picture in people's head when we talk about affordable housing. And we can talk about NIMBYs, not in my backyard. I live on what was absolutely what used to be farmland. We still have a farm behind the development. Right. And not that long ago, a development was proposed not that far away from us, and no one wanted it in their backyard. Right. And it was a really interesting conversation to be a part of because we were clearly living on land that once was someone else's farm backyard.
So you're in a development.
I'm in someone else's backyard now. But there's a lot of misconceptions even around what affordable housing looks like and who lives there. Yeah. And, we know that crime doesn't increase when you have denser housing. We know that car traffic doesn't go up that much. A lot of times folks will talk about impact on school districts, but especially apartments and townhouses, we really don't see that. Right. So that's one of the calls to action for the Coalition for Sustainable Housing, to really go out to communities and help shatter some of these myths and explain what will be there.
Understand. Yeah. I know when I worked for HDC and PHFA outside of Lancaster County, because I was traveling all over central Pennsylvania and northern tier, and those misconceptions were so ingrained. And one of the other misconceptions was that, if they put in an affordable housing development near my neighborhood, my property value is going to go down.
Yeah.
And that's been proven over and over and over again to not be true.
It's
and actually,
not the case.
Raises your property value. Yeah. In 99% of the cases, and those that doesn't, it pretty much stays the same.
Yeah, and even our picture, I think, in our head of what affordable housing is. And I grew up in the Midwest, so I still remember Chicago and Cabrini Green. And I think folks imagine that. And modern day affordable housing blends right in with the communities. You wouldn't know if you didn't know.
Yeah.
But there's just that. I think people have those pictures in their heads, and it's kind of hard to overcome some of that.
I'll give a shout out to the organization I'm on the board for, Community Basics. HDC does phenomenal work as well. So I think this applies to both of them. But Bousman apartments that are being built right now, you drive by that, there's no way you would know that that's affordable housing. Right?
Absolutely.
It's beautiful. They're great looking garden apartments and townhouse type buildings that look fantastic. Country Club apartments over by Greenfield Corporate Center. Like, there's market rate apartment communities, and right next to Country Club, and somebody new to the area would never be able to guess which was which.
Yeah.
So, I think there's so many misconceptions. We have this idea from the projects that were built in the 70s that were like mass produced quickly and affiliated with a lot of other things that were probably not well thought out in, as far as design and placement. But we're in a different era. We've I think gotten to a different place in what these the subsidized affordable housing, the tax credit affordable housing can be, should be, and how it impacts our communities. But we still have the barriers to overcome.
We've gotten a lot smarter too, I think, about our knowledge of how different income levels should live within community together. And so I think a lot of your developers, HDC is a good example of this. It's different price points within a community because we shouldn't exclude neighbors who make less to certain parts of our community. We should all live together. And then there's even that upward mobility within a community. Okay, I've outgrown my apartment. Maybe it's the townhouse now. And then maybe it's the single family home within that same footprint. I already know my neighbors. I'm walkable to things. Building community through housing that way.
Yeah. So I live in Southeast Lancaster City, and the neighborhood that I moved into had been completely transformed through urban renewal. And neighborhoods were pretty much leveled, where it was row homes, nice size houses. Those communities, I hear from my neighbors all the time. Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. J, when I first moved into South Christian Street, gave me the greatest education ever, talking about the history of Lancaster City. And she talked about the neighborhood and how it used to be, at this corner was a high school teacher, and over here was a doctor, and over here was a paralegal whose husband was a supervisor at a plant, and like just all different diversity. And then there were those who were working in some lower income jobs, and those who were struggling to make it, all in the same neighborhood, community supporting one another. And then urban renewal was like, we need more of these projects. And so houses were destroyed. Housing was built only for one strata of our economic diversity. And so it was like, here's housing for poor people. And so a lot of those families moved to other parts of the city or out of the city, those who could afford to, and those who couldn't were all then placed in one neighborhood together. And I think that perpetuated some of the myths about what housing is and could be and how it impacts communities. But that idea of creating communities that are truly mixed income, that have affordable rental rates and purchase rates in with those that are a little bit higher, closer to market rate or a little bit above, actually creates a really dynamic community, which is good for everybody.
Yeah. Another one I think of often, I'm in Manheim Township.
Yeah.
And Grandview was one of the first mixed income planned communities. And I don't think folks consider that when we talk about some of the new builds that are coming into town. And everybody, I want to live in Grandview. I can't find a house in Grandview because they sell as soon as they come on the market. But that's townhouses.
Yep.
There's a few row homes. There's an apartment complex in there. And then there's single family.
Yeah.
It's walkable to the city. It's right along major arteries. It's a great
You're
example of what we could.
There.
I know. Oh, my word. Every time I drive through there, it's just lovely. And that was brilliant.
Yeah.
That we came up with something like that, and being able to replicate that in the appropriate areas in our community, I think is really key.
Yeah. I believe it was at either a C4SH meeting or maybe looking at the recently completed equity study, talked about the number of units. And I know 5 years ago, we talked about we needed to create 1,000 units of affordable housing per year for the next 10 years to meet the current demand.
Yeah.
And I think the most recent was now we need to create 1,200 units per year in order to meet the current demand. So that's basically 12,000 units of affordable housing below what the demand is. Right. What are some of the contributing? How did we get into this situation? From your perspective, what are some of those contributing factors that have put us in such a hole?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different contributing factors. For instance, we just did a study with EDC, and one of the things we looked at is the housing stock that's aging out. You live in a community that was part of the founding of this country.
Right.
Housing stock from the 17 or 1800s, in order to maintain that and not have units dropping off at the same time. We have, I believe it's 60 separate municipalities in our community and 500 plus separate zoning districts.
Oh my goodness.
So what you could zone even across the street could be completely different from what you could zone on the land you owned. And we've worked to zone land to encourage single family housing. And I think some of that's some NIMBYism and thoughts around what comes when we build denser housing, when we build apartments and townhouses. And then we also live in a land that has beautiful green space. And so the challenge of maintaining farmland preservation and our trails and the nature that we really love also means it drives up land prices.
Right.
And when things are scarce, the prices go up. And so we do have some scarcity, and we have, a couple other perfect storms coming together.
That's an interesting dynamic, that challenge that we face in Lancaster County, because we all love our agricultural history here. I'm not from Lancaster County originally, but I've been here 30 years. I love the fact that I live in the city, and within 5 minutes, I can be in the woods in Lancaster County Park, and in 5 minutes from there, I can be out in farmland and not even realize there's a city within reach. It's beautiful, and obviously the agricultural history contributes so much to our culture and to our economy.
Right.
But there is a way to do both, isn't there?
Yeah.
And I know there's been a lot of work around that, and maybe you can speak to how do you maintain that, the culture and the history and what makes Lancaster uniquely Lancaster, while also increasing housing stock.
Yeah, and the Coalition for Sustainable Housing, which really focuses on education, outreach, advocacy, aligns itself closely with Places 2040, which is Lancaster County Planning Department's comprehensive plan. So the plan is not legislative, it's not enforceable, it is suggestive. Yeah. But it has outlined areas within Lancaster County where we want to focus on preserving farmland because that is either the best soil or where there's other farmland around, and then other areas that we would consider urban growth areas. And so an urban growth area could be something along a major route. So we already know traffic's coming here. We actually lessen traffic if we build along that because people hop off more quickly. Or places where we already have infrastructure, water, sewer in place.
So you're not having the exorbitant costs to run sewer lines into a whole new area.
Yeah, and costs go up when you're building suburbs outside of those areas because you have to build out and maintain roads, water lines, all of that.
And I know, from my engagement with the Coalition for Sustainable Housing, which you co-chair, those plans would allow for sufficient development and growth.
Yes.
And those plans were contributed to by most of the municipalities. I know I don't know if all 60 participated in those planning exercises, but I know they were engaged, the vast majority of them. And yet we still face challenges. Even though everybody sits around the table and we're like, yes, this is how we can meet the needs in our community now. This is how we can grow in a healthy way, which is going to help the economy and help all of us who are already here. But we're not doing it. And we'll probably talk some more in our next episode about some of the ways we can create solutions. It happens on the municipal level. You talked a little bit about the zoning and code restrictions that make it hard. How do we begin to move the needle here in Lancaster County and see change around this affordable housing crisis? Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Yeah, one of the things I love about Lancaster County is I think it is a county that is collaborative and works to solve solutions together. And that always gives me hope about this community. And I think the housing crisis is becoming one that it's impacted so many people that attention really has turned to it. And on one hand, that's kind of a shame because you want to care about your neighbors regardless of where they are in their income spectrum. But we've reached such a crisis point, we're going to have to solve the problem. But also people here care, and they're working across this county. And, maybe it's 5 beds here, or we're going to build 10 houses here. Right. But there's forward momentum instead of just turning a blind eye to that.
Turning our
people
back
care, and that really does make a big difference. It means a lot.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us today, Kate. Thank you for your work with the Coalition and with United Way. And I know you are a big part of raising that awareness and getting the word out, inviting people to think about solutions. How can we contribute together? Thank you for listening and joining us for the podcast today. We appreciate you taking your time. Hopefully you learned a little, and hopefully we can, in our next episode, I think we're going to lean in a little bit on what solutions are there. How can we work towards maybe not solving this problem? It's not going to happen quickly, but over time, can we make significant change? Again, thanks for joining us on the Restores podcast. Take care.